as was mentioned, this is hiring and being hired. If this was not the talk you came to listen to, feel free to get down and leave, or later.
Three chairs over there still.
So hiring and being hired is a game that probably almost all of us play. We're all involved somehow. I like to get to know a little bit about my audience. So how many of you have been hired at some point? How many of you have done hiring?
You guys want to sit down?
Okay, good mix. So my talk kind of goes to both sides of the table, from an interviewee or from someone who's hiring. Are there any burning things that, so tell me a little bit about you. What are you hoping to get out of this topic? Any volunteers?
The job.
Job? Talk to me after.
Just a way to help weed out candidates. What I thought was a good candidate, and it kind of bit me in the butt later.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges of hiring, is figuring out, is it a good fit or not? This is an example of what happens when hiring goes wrong. Why did you leave your last job? Well, the company relocated into the town. You don't want to be like that. So why am I giving this talk? So I have been involved a lot in hiring
More seats up front still.
over the years. I ran my own company for about 10 years, hired and managed a team there. I currently work at Vivint, and over the last year and a half, our department's grown from maybe around 30 people to about 100. And I was involved in probably 98% of at least the technical interviews, and in some cases, the whole process. My philosophies have changed a bit over time. I think I've kind of learned more about what I think helps me find the right candidates for the positions I'm trying to fill. And obviously, I've been hired at jobs before, so I know what I like to see when I'm interviewing with a company. I find it interesting. I like discussing it with people. I've talked with a bunch of people about how they do hiring, kind of seeing some of the different ways that people do it. And I welcome additional input and data. So if anyone wants to talk hiring, by all means, let's sit down and chat. And I hope that this will help encourage sane processes for hiring. There's nothing more frustrating to me than seeing a situation where the people doing the hiring are doing things weird, and they end up making bad connections. They get somebody who's not the right person for the job, and then they're frustrated. The person who got hired is frustrated because it doesn't work out, and it's not a long-term thing. And hopefully, this will make the world a happier place by the time we're done. So, first, I guess, is the purpose. Why do we do hiring? Well, both sides have different goals. Sorry, both sides have goals. Some of them are different, some of them aren't. The employer obviously has a need he wants to fill. He needs some sort of skill set, or he needs just more manpower, he needs to grow his team, whatever that may be. There's some kind of need that they're trying to fill. They usually want to get some kind of good value. They want to know that what they're paying and what they're getting for what they're paying is going to match up with them. That's an important thing. And usually, not always, but usually the goal is a successful long-term relationship. Turnover is a pain in the butt for everyone involved. Sometimes it's necessary, but when you can avoid it, you usually want to. As an employee, if I'm looking for a job, I'm trying to find a way that I can trade my time and skills for compensation of some sort. Usually, good environment is high on the list, reasonable expectations, something that I enjoy doing, are all things I'm looking for. And likewise, I usually want a successful long-term relationship. That's really the best win for everybody. So what makes a relationship sustainable between an employer and an employee? To me, I think there are a few key items, but it matters to both sides. So, you both want to make it work usually. One of the first things to me is that you want a good match between the work and the worker. This comes down to skill set, workload, expectations about responsibilities, and things like that. That's a big one to me. Personalities and communication stuff. Yeah, question.
Do you encourage us to make the work sound a whole lot worse than it really is?
I'll talk more about this later, but no, I usually don't. I'm a big fan of being pretty straightforward and honest. You can't sugarcoat it or, make it look awful. If you do make it look awful and someone still takes the job, then obviously, they're going to be a lot happier than someone who you made it look really great, and then they get there and find out it's not. But I'm a pretty straightforward guy, and I really am a big fan of openness and just being clear and direct.
Do you think our tendency is, though, to sugarcoat, so we have to kind of teach ourselves to make it
Absolutely.
as mundane and realistic? Maybe realistic's a better one.
Realistic, I think is the word I would
Worse.
go with. Yeah, absolutely. I totally believe in being realistic. And that goes both ways. The employee has to be just as realistic about their skill set as the employer is about what the job is. Personalities and communication style can make a huge difference, both with the manager and with the team of people you'll be working with. Sometimes you don't always, as a candidate, get to meet many of the people on the team, but if you get the opportunity to ask questions about it, find out about what the team dynamic is like, usually you can find out a lot of good information that can help you decide if that's going to be something that fits you. Personal growth and career progress
More chairs
is
right in
usually
front in the
something
middle.
that many employees are seeking for. So that's something to consider as an employer and an employee when you're looking. What does that look like? What do they expect? Is this a position they want somebody to be in and they'll be in it forever? Or are there opportunities to grow and advance to the next stage? The bottom line to a sustainable relationship, I think, is that it has to consistently be win-win. If you have a win-lose deal, or even worse, a lose-lose deal, at least one of the two groups is not going to want to keep doing it, and then you're going to end up with turnover. So, the interview process, right? This is kind of critical in the whole hiring thing. This is an example of maybe a less than ideal interview. So we have here an interviewer who's asking a question that might be a red flag to a candidate, first of all. If they're asking you how you feel about long hours, that might be an indicator that they're going to have long. And this candidate might also be trying to be a people pleaser, trying to paint himself as, hey, I'll do whatever you want, I just want this job. Unless that really is what you're trying to do, don't act that way, or you'll end up in a job you're not happy with. And then we have an interviewer who is kind of making some assumptions and inferring things into answers that might not really be intended. So how do you have a good interview process? Well, what are we doing it for? We want to determine if there's a fit, right? If you're going to make a win-win situation, there's got to be a good fit from both sides. And the employer and the employer are both trying to determine this from their own point of view at the same time. You need to get familiar with each other to find out if it's a good fit. Part of it is mitigating risk. So what are some of the risks of hiring the wrong person or taking the wrong job?
Hiring the wrong person, you end up with someone who really kind of drags your team dynamic down.
Yeah.
So you end up with bad morale, people complaining about that one person. It just causes all sorts of headaches.
Yeah.
Some employees can be literally poisonous to the work environment.
Absolutely.
Yes.
If you get the wrong person on the team, you literally can drag the whole team down. And hiring that guy.
Best case scenario, you're training someone that isn't going to stay.
Right. Yeah. Even if they're just not happy, you're going to lose them, and you're putting effort and time into that. Go back.
A couple of years ago, I was working at a company, and I interviewed with them, and they said, yeah, we do, cutting edge Perl, we do this, that, and the other. And I got on the team, and a lot of the practices that I was used to using programmatically, I was being told not to use, and I didn't understand why at first, and I found out that some of the other programmers just didn't understand the syntax. And that was a real frustration for me. It created a lot of friction between me and the rest of the team. And then I come to the job I'm currently at, and they're just kind of like, they honestly told you not to do that? I mean, we do that all the time. That's our bread and butter here.
Right.
And so, for me, part of my frustration as someone looking for work, not that I am right now, but when I'm in that position, I want to meet the team. I want to meet the people that I will be working with, because I have no clue what level of competency I'm going to be dealing with. I love my job now. It's great.
Right.
I mean, people I've worked with have IQs 120 plus easily. But if I can't see what the team is like, it's really hard for me to judge, is the question the interviewee or interviewer is asking is actually relevant to the kind of things I'm going to be dealing with.
Right, and an interviewer's and an interviewee's vision of what best practices means in the language they're working with might be entirely different. And as an interviewee, you can get a lot from the questions they're asking, especially if they get into some technical questions, some examples and things like that. Sometimes you can learn what they're getting at, but those are absolutely the right kinds of things that we want to avoid. So the interview is meant to help us each do that. Some of you may have been in one of those interviews where they ask some of the same, typical interview questions. Oh, what's your worst flaw? Well, I'm just too honest, too hardworking. I just, I can't balance work and life. If you ask a question like that, don't be too surprised with what you get back. There are times that some of those can be useful. You can legitimately learn something from someone by asking something like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But it's not always a home run question, for example. So a little caveat here. If you have a room full of people like this, there are at least N+1 opinions about how this should be done. So this is my 2 cents about what an interview should be like. Take it for what it's worth. To me, a big part is planning the interview. What should the process be like for a candidate? There are a lot of different answers to this. How many interviews do you usually see at jobs that you interview for or jobs that you've been interviewed for? 4? Okay, we've got 4. 2?
Do you define interview?
Great question. I don't know if I can. Let's call it
Contacts?
yeah, an opportunity to contact someone for the purpose of discussing your fit for a particular job. So it might include phone interviews.
Usually anywhere between like 1 and 6.
Yeah, there's a big range. 6, I've heard as many as 14.
Ouch. I work for that company.
No, well, that's the funny part. I know some great managers that work there, and I know a lot of great things about the companies, but their interview process is a whole day experience where you literally meet with 14 different people, half an hour at a time. Right? Ending with the CEO for every employee in the company. So they're very thorough. Are there benefits of having a lot of interviews? Yeah, they meet everybody. They know whether or not this is a fit. One of the problems with it, besides the pain and suffering for the candidate, is that you then have a whole lot of input. You've got 14, 16, 18 different opinions about this person that you're trying to hire. That can be good, that can be bad. So one interview. What are some of the possible problems you might have by having just one interview with a candidate?
It's really easy to fake your way through it.
Yeah? Depending on the interview, it can be easy to fake your way through.
You
Yeah.
don't get enough information out of them.
Right? There are things you won't know. There absolutely are.
They could be the perfect candidate and you'd never know it because they were sick that day.
Right. Yeah. There are some people that if they miss an interview, if they're late for an interview, if they don't bring a copy of the resume to the interview, or even in the resume screening, there are things that people just write off. You might miss out on some really good people that way.
You may not find out what the company's like. That could be a good person, and the rest of the company's all rotten too.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways. It's a two-way street on that.
It is, and for the candidate, sometimes if they don't get enough opportunity to find out about what they're coming into, they might still have questions that would make them say, I've got this other offer, I feel more confident about it, I'm going to go there. And so you might lose a great candidate. Who should be doing the interview?
Not HR.
Yeah.
Amen, brother. I don't know why HR always wants to talk to people. So weird to me.
It is kind of their job.
Well, fair enough, but prospective employees, I don't know, maybe there are some HR groups that do add some value to the interviewing process. I don't know that I've seen any.
We say the final interview has to be done by the direct supervisor, because that's the person they're going to work for. They're the ones who have to put up with the headache with them. If everybody else says this guy's not worth it, but that person is the one who's going to work for them and says, hey, they have what I need, so be it.
I think that's absolutely a key thing. The person who is their direct manager has to be a key part of the interview process, because ultimately they're the one that's going to end up dealing with it, responsible for it, accountable for how this person performs. Yeah, no?
We always have them interview with the person they're going to be working for, and at least 1 to 2 people they're going to be working with. Because
that can be a really
peers
good
have a
practice.
really good read on what kind of person they're talking to. If you know how to ask the peers the right questions too.
Right. And that can vary depending on which of the peers you ask. Some of them might be better at it than others. Some of them might scare them away. You never know.
On the notice, as far as the HR being involved in the interview process, I have never worked in HR, so I don't know, but I've heard where HR of one, or HR department has contacts with other HRs in other companies completely, and so there could be a inside, even though it's illegal, to pass on that kind of information.
Yeah.
It does happen.
There's a boundary between like research about a candidate and like cyber stalking, you know, that kind of a thing.
Getting blurred, but, you know.
Yeah, the line is getting blurred. Thanks, NSA. Yeah, no, there are some real things there. Direct manager is always great to have there. Having some colleagues there can be great. Sometimes the manager's manager wants to meet them. That usually can be good too. One of the things to be careful about is, depending on the position you're hiring for, make sure that at least some of the people doing interviewing are skilled at the same kinds of things that the candidate is skilled at. The place where I work right now, we have a wide variety of managers. Some of them have been programmers before, some of them in our field, some of them in other fields. Some of them are not really that technical, but they're good at managing technical teams. So, you know, you might want to have a separate technical interview from a personality or culture fit interview. Yeah.
If you do not technically interview a technical person, you're a fool.
And if they take the job, they're probably a fool too. If you haven't gotten a chance to talk tech with the tech people at the company you're looking at, be worried, because there might be an issue.
Well, at the same time, not all companies are big enough to maybe handle interviewing a candidate for a specific kind of job. Like,
Right.
if you're the first developer in a company that's mostly been like cold sales or something, and they're like, okay, we need to actually develop a product to automate this or whatever.
Yeah, they know enough to know they need a Linux sysadmin, but they have never hired one. They don't have one, so that's why they're looking for one.
Yeah, so you
Still a red
kind
flag.
of have to.
You hire someone to do that interview then.
That can be a scary situation, yeah, and contracting help, you know, bringing in a professional to help with the interview
That is a strategy.
can be a great strategy. There definitely is some benefit to that. If you're the first of a kind in the company, whether you're founder or employee number 200, and you're first in that kind of a role, there can be some pros and cons to it. You know, you might be going into a situation where you've got a lot of freedom and flexibility to just be awesome and get them off on the right foot and get them started with that.
And if you're a candidate that knows that, you kind of, your best option is really to kind of own that and sell yourself as that and what they need and why, and kind of be that fit, or why you're not.
Right, but also find out, what team are you going to be on, who you're working for, because if they don't have expertise in your role, then you need to know and be confident that they're going to respect you, that they're going to listen to you, and if you say, no, that's a 3-week project, they're not going to say, okay, great, have it in a week, because they don't get it. And so that can be a big thing to look at. How long should the interviews be? What's the longest or shortest interview you've ever held or had for a job?
Our final is supposed to be at least 5 hours.
At least? At least?
Is there pizza involved?
Yeah, normally we
It's
do.
like a practical...
Well, we believe that everyone comes to an interview with a bucket worth of energy to put on a performance. And you've got to get through that bucket of performance energy to get to who the person really is. Because in our company, once you're hired, we will kill ourselves to make people happy and try to keep them. So you don't want to make a mistake. It's just too costly.
Okay, 5 hours? I mentioned one that's like an all-day event.
This has happened, it wasn't great, but we got an intern that was well, I don't know that even, I think there's a phone interview involved, but just basically one person made the decision, and then you've got an intern.
Okay. For an intern, that might be a little less risky.
Yeah.
That's usually a temporary
I mean, it
relationship from the
depends on the
start.
person making the call, but.
It does. If the only person ever making that call is their direct manager, should be. I've been in situations where I've had people hired onto my team. That's kind of a scary situation too. So don't do that to anybody for what that's worth if you're in a position to do so. So yeah, length of interviews. Anyone shortest interview? 10 minutes? Do you feel like it was effective?
He's trying to get me quick.
I've been able to rule someone out in 5 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I had to sit with them for another 55.
Yeah.
I've been there, done that, yes.
Shortest one I had was the HR called them up and they says, there's no jobs, there's no openings, forget it, get lost. And I said, are you sure? And I called through the grapevine. The guy did something. A little while later, HR, that same guy, was calling back and says, I'd like to offer you a job. And it was the same guy that says, no way.
Not HR.
More evidence.
Especially when I hired a guy and I got hired, so it was, he was
Yeah.
in a hurry to get out of there.
No, there are some weird situations. For me, my personal opinion, for interns, I just did a set of interviews, like 6 back to back to back that were like half hour each. That was a little quick for my tastes, but for an intern and for the number I had to deal with logistically, it worked. And we got some good people out of that. We found who we were looking for. For most of our regular positions, I try and keep interviews to an hour at a time. You're right, but that someone can put on a performance for an hour if they really, really want to. Usually it ends up coming out in one way or another. I've seen some great resumes, but then you start talking to the person and it's clear that, yes, they might have been sitting in that seat, but they weren't super great at their job. In the back?
Now, we interviewed someone for about 10 minutes. We gave them basically an assignment. Have you ever heard this language before? No? Okay, we're going to give you an assignment, do this. And he performed amazingly. He was one of the best hires we ever had.
Yeah, and getting something practical can be a great way to get at those things. How many of you have a feel, how many do group interviews versus one-on-one interviews?
One-on-one.
One-on-one?
Never, ever group.
Never ever group? Group. How big of a group?
Oh, it depends. It really does. It depends on who I'm hiring for. Usually it's about 3 people.
Okay, 3 is a good number for a group, I think.
We do one group, but almost all of them should be one-on-one, I think. But I think one group in the mix is a really good idea.
Okay.
Team.
It depends on the style of interview, I'd say, because we'll take them out to lunch. You could
Yeah.
call that a group interview.
Yeah.
But sitting there with 3 people grilling them will
That's a
shut
bad
down
idea.
every candidate I've ever interviewed. Shut them off.
If it is grilling, then yeah, I would tend to agree. I like grilling for my food, but not for my candidates usually.
Group on which side?
Oh, great question. Anybody a fan of group candidate interviews?
No.
Yeah, no. Good point, I didn't even think about those. So far outside of my
As you
experience.
decides there on the candidate side, doing a group interview is okay if you have like a checklist. This is not like, this is menial labor kind of a thing. Can you, the 50 pounds, can you go, we need one body.
Hiring in bulk, I would call it, yeah.
There is actually a counter statement to that.
Yes.
In St. George, we work in the community a lot. We work a lot with teaching classes, doing things like that. Those actually can become group interviews where you have a body of students, all of whom are training for that sort of job. The ones who stand out are the ones who ace the group interview. I wouldn't consider those formal interviews, but you could construe it as that.
Yeah, no, it's true. Great point. So one of the advantages to me of the group interview is I don't have to make the candidate come back 3, 4, 5 times, especially if they're already employed. That can become a real awkward thing. You can only come up with so many excuses in 1 week why you need an hour off of work. But,
We're in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming.
oh, yeah, I've been to Wyoming.
Have you really been to Wyoming or through Wyoming?
Mostly through, admittedly, yeah, unless it's for fireworks.
Yeah, one of the things that our company does after probably 1 or 2 phone interviews is we actually bring the person out and either pay for their gas or fly them out. It's just kind of out of necessity that we have
Yeah.
2 or 3 interviews that day.
Right. No, convenience for you and the candidate, being able to move quickly is also a benefit in most cases. You know, so the one I mentioned that does like 14 interviews all day long, you know, half hour with 14 different people, can be kind of intense. At the same time, if you need at least who they're working for and 1 or 2 of who they're working with, maybe a technical expert or their grand boss, boss's boss type of person who wants to meet them, or heaven forbid, HR, there can be some advantages of doing that as a group. What we found with our technical interviews, for example, is we were all curious about the same things, wanting to ask the same questions. And so we would get usually about 3 of us in the room while we asked the questions. And usually there would only be 1 of us asking most of the questions, or we take turns asking a question. But I was surprised and glad at how different of a read each of the 3 of us could get from some of the same answers. Some might interpret it as, oh, you know, he looked really nervous on that. He must not know what he's doing. Others said, no, it looked like, you know, he had something stuck in his shoe. He was like, you know, I don't think it was his nerves about the problem. He had something else going on. You know, whatever it is. I do like small group interviews on the interviewer side. But one-on-one also end up, in a lot of cases, being good. I'm in kind of a weird position now where I find myself as both a technical expert in the field I'm hiring for, or close to one, and the manager of the team that they're going to be on. And so I kind of can cover a lot of the bases all at once, even if I am alone. I love to have a second opinion, you know, someone else to back me up and confirm what I'm feeling about the candidate, but you know, I've hired quite a few people off with meeting them for an hour, and so far most of them have worked out pretty well. Granted, you know, a lot of them are still newer.
I was going to suggest, and I've experienced this before on both sides, if you're going to do a group interview with people who are not used to doing an interview, school them on the do's and don'ts of being the interviewer.
Right.
When the candidate is answering questions, don't be texting your girlfriend. I brought a friend in where one place I used to work, and it was the, we'll quote, say, manager of the group. You know, they'd ask a question, he'd be, my friend would be going, answering stuff, and not looking at him, just honest. And I'm like, if I was him, I would not take a job if you want for down, because I'm like, if that's.
Yeah, respect in an interview goes both ways.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it says something about either party if they're disrespectful. That kind of gets a little bit to my next slide. There's a lot of interview advice out there, in general, as well as some that's specific to technical people. If your phone rings during the interview, first of all, why is your phone ringing during an interview? You know, take care of the simple things before you get going. But, you know, most of the usual advice is really reasonably good, but know the company you're applying for. One of the companies I worked at happened to be a particular headphone company located up in Park City, has some affiliations with kind of a skateboarder or snowboarder. Yeah, you know, they got a headphone brand that's partnered with like Snoop Dogg and stuff. Every time a candidate showed up in a tie, most of my colleagues would say, "Oh, he's out." So know where you're applying. You know, I'm not advocating, you know, show up in a ratty t-shirt and, you know, shorts and flip-flops, unless that's the kind of company you're applying for. If you are going to work at, you know, a shop on a beach somewhere, that might be appropriate attire. For a programmer, probably not. But know where you're applying, because it can make a difference. It's awkward when someone comes super overdressed for an interview, just like it is when the interviewer or interviewee are super underdressed for the interview. Obviously, try and put your best foot forward, but be yourself. If you're hiding things or not being who you normally are, then you're not going to get a good read on whether it's going to be fit. Do you have something?
Yeah, I've become completely cynical about resumes. The only thing I like about a resume is it gives me something to ask questions about. I don't believe anything on there. I don't know, maybe all the rest of you would like to hear your input, but that's why my first interview is always on the phone, because I'm sick of bringing people in and taking my time out of my day and find out they've just written down, yeah, once I took a class on VMware, and I don't believe anything I read.
Yeah. For me, it's a huge turnoff if someone has stuff on the resume that's kind of over fluffed or borderline truth. If you're putting something on your resume, expect to be asked questions about it. It doesn't matter how old and obscure it is. Someone at one of the companies you interview with will be an expert in that and will be like, oh, I found another person that works with this language. Let's geek out, and they'll quickly know that you're full of it, and it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well. So yeah, dishonesty or partial disclosure from either party really it isn't helpful for anyone. Dilbert, as always, has some good material that's relevant to this. Culture is an interesting one. Here we have an example of Dilbert trying to fit in. So, yes, he might get the job.
Can you enlarge that a little? Kind of hard.
Probably 3 of them.
I don't know if
There we go.
Yeah.
So, also as a company, be aware of what your culture says about you as a company. Yes?
Along the lines of, kind of fluffing a resume, do you have any advice on so I've used C++, but it was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Do I list that on my resume? Because if I was asked a question about it now, I don't know if I'd be able to answer.
To me, I think the things I find most useful on a resume are things that people have used enough and recently enough that they'd be comfortable using it should the need arise.
So
I'm either looking for you to be able to do something for me with it, or I'm looking to know that you have that as part of your background. But being clear about what's what, that if you're not interested in a language anymore, just leave it off your resume. Unless it's such a big part of your career history that, it looks really weird to not tell that part of the story. You had something, I think, and then in back.
Well, yeah, so as an interviewer, we're looking for things to talk about. If it's on your resume, it's very good. Which means that writing a resume, you should say, oh, I can talk about C++, or I want them to talk to me about it. So that would be a good reason to put it on or take it off.
Yeah, and order matters too. Prioritize your list, with the most important or the most proficient stuff toward the beginning. Yes,
So I'm going to get your interview, and then I'm going to interview you. And you say one of my favorites is somebody says they're a JavaScript expert. Love to break those people. But what I really look for is that you've achieved competency in that and you can talk confidently about that language. If you can't do that about C++ anymore, leave it off your resume. But if you can at least talk intelligently about the language, I'd love it.
Right.
And I, as an interviewer, wouldn't mind it.
Yeah, in the back?
Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of programming languages, especially with the 3rd and 4th generation, there's not a huge lot of syntactical difference. I mean, conceptually, they're the same thing. So, yeah, primarily I program in Perl, but I can do the same things in any other language. You point me at it, and I will learn it and figure it out. The syntax is the only difference. So, sometimes when I've gone to employers in the past, I've said, yeah, I've worked in all these languages. Primarily, I do X, but I can work in all these languages and anything else you want to throw at me.
Right. Yeah, and there are employers where that's extremely valuable, and others where it has less value to them, and they might not be a great fit for someone who is a great generalist, and they just want someone who's done this for 5 years, and even if it's only been around for 3.
Not HR.
Yeah. So, one of the core things in an interview is the questions, right? There are good questions, not so good questions. Coming up with good questions can be hard.
Going on to questions, I had an interview for a job that I really just applied for because I just needed a job.
Yeah.
And the interview was, can you open a Word document? Well, yeah, show me. I did it. Open Excel. Okay, I did that. Now, Google search this, and it was 10 minutes of Google searches. Okay, you're hired. Okay. Come to find out, my job was to dig through all kinds of documentation listed on servers across this gigantic network, and it was easy. But that interview, I thought at the time, was ridiculous and stupid. I didn't have a bad attitude. I had a good attitude. It worked out.
Yeah, might have been HR. That tells you, though, as an interviewee, a whole lot. A smart interview does address the things that you care about and get at the meat of the matter. If what they need is opening Word docs and Google searches, you know, if you were going for a programming job and they gave you that interview,
Run.
leave, you know, thank them for their time and get out, because you know, that's not going to be it.
Offer a contract as a consultant to automate the process.
There you go.
Yeah, I can automate that way. Go ahead.
So do we not, or do we like that question? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? You might.
It depends what you're trying to get out of it. If you want to know about their aspirations and their goals, or how good they are at BSing, or you know, just how do they answer it, that can tell you something about how they think. That can be a valid question, and I've used that question before.
I think that
I never got that
job.
answer, but
I told him honestly, I was getting a QA job, and I said, well, I'm really hoping after 5 years I learn how to do QA. Whereas they were looking for anybody that said something about, well, I'm hoping to be a manager by now. They just filtered all those people out.
yeah, some places want people who are upwardly mobile, and other places don't.
Yeah, at that point, they just wanted someone that wanted to come in and learn the trade.
Yeah, I had a brother-in-law who got hired onto a team of 6 or 8 people, and really none of the people on the team were manager material. And so they hired him specifically because he wanted to join the team, even though he was kind of entry level in their industry. But he also has a management history. He can lead. And so that was something they wanted, and others don't want it. This is where being clear about, you know, from both sides is important. And you don't have to tell them before necessarily, before they answer the question whether you're looking for it or looking to not get it. But yeah, I mean, the questions that we ask have to be based around what we're trying to get. You know, what we're trying to find out. You know, determine their skills. Technical and non-technical skills they might be needing for their job are definitely fair game. Getting to know them, personality, culture fit. You know your team usually. You know who's going to fit in and work well with the team, and who's going to do that thing that other annoying guy who left did, and it's going to drive everyone crazy. Mitigating risk. Think of the worst things that you want to make sure you eliminate from possibility, and ask the questions that help you get to that. If whatever that risk is that you're worried about, ask about it. You know.
So is it fair to ask them? So, you know, because I work in an open environment, and some guy brings his bowl of cereal on every freaking morning. And who likes to listen to Captain Crunch? You know?
Great reason for a closed office
Oh,
environment.
I'm telling you. I came from where I had my own office to that kind of environment, so it's a bit difficult. But how can you ask that? I mean, how do you ask questions around something like that?
That's an interesting. Any ideas?
What do you like to do in the morning?
Yeah.
That is one.
How OCD are you?
HR. Send it to HR. They can have their checklist about, you know, their personal hygiene habits.
There you go, the
HR, yeah. They can do this area.
Another approach is like, you're hired, but you're only here for 90 days and then we'll make a decision again.
Right.
We had to
actually provisional hires. That can be kind of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. If a candidate is looking for a long-term position and then to find that you want him to come, but you're not sure you want him to stay.
I mean, 90% of the time it's just straight through, but it does give the option should you need it.
Yeah.
I mean, you've always got an option, but kind of.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, usually my opinion is if you're not sure you want them, keep looking. And a lot of the time, pretty quickly. I'm a big fan of making sure that we ask about compensation. Very, very rarely will we make someone an offer that doesn't match or exceed their compensation expectations. Because they're not likely to accept it. If they overvalue themselves, then they're probably not a fit. And really, is there or is there not some overlap between what I think you're worth and what you think you're worth? And just getting straight to the heart of that, as awkward as it can sometimes be to ask someone, hey, how much money do you want to make? I think it's worth taking that risk and just getting it out of the way, so you know what to expect. It'll also save you hassle with making offers that get rejected or getting into weird negotiations and ending up with funny stories about, wow, did you see that guy? He wanted X, Y, Z. And if you answer the question, stick to your answer. We had a guy who, at one point, told us what he wanted to be making and got an offer for at least that, and then started negotiating for like more and more, and it doesn't work for us. Yeah.
On that note, especially I've worked in several states, and I don't know if it's like in the area surrounding Utah, like Wyoming or anything, but Utah has a very wide gap of kind of compensation values for specific tech positions, and so asking that question early can really save a lot of time on both halves. And
yeah, absolutely. I, for many years, ran a web development contract consulting firm in Salt Lake City, and we dreaded Utah Valley clients because they were always comparing our hourly rate to what it would cost them to get a BYU student, or an army of BYU students for $15 an hour. And, their perceived value of us and our perceived value of the work we were doing just didn't match up. And so it wasn't usually worth our time. Let's see, back here and then here.
One of my biggest frustrations when I was interviewing a few years ago was I'd go into the interview and everything was feeling great, and they'd ask me how much I want, and I'd say, yeah, if you can pay me $25 an hour, I'll be happy. And they're just kind of like...
And they laugh you out of the room?
Yeah, they laughed me out of the room. Because at the time I had the experience, I had the know-how, I had the skills, it's just I wasn't asking enough. And so...
They assume that you're junior because you don't have...
Right, but I mean, I had the credentials, I had the work, I could show them the code I had written and say, yes, I can do exactly what you want me to do. I just didn't require a lot of compensation for it.
Right. And there are some jobs that are really enjoyable, and people will work for a lot less because they enjoy the job. It doesn't mean they're not qualified for it necessarily.
At some point in your career, your time is worth more than the money, too.
Yeah.
If they give you a month off, and you're getting, paid $50 an hour, and you're really worth 90, it's worth the 50 just for the extra time off.
Yeah, the compensation package is a package.
So I primarily hire programmers, and what I've learned is that programmers actually don't care that much about what they're making. Offer them enough money so that money is not an issue, and they're going to care more about how much fun they're going to have at work.
This is getting to be, I think, more and more the case with today's work environment. Our recruiters and HR tell us consistently that unemployment right now in our sector is like 1.4% or something, which is, for all intents and purposes, zero. Everyone who is looking for a job or who you would want to hire for a job is already working somewhere. And so they're comparing, I had a guy who interviewed because his current job was a 15-minute commute and ours would be a 5-minute. Totally awesome guy. We hired him and then had to tell him, by the way, we just got our team moved to Provo instead of
Is he looking again?
No, he's not. At least he hasn't told us.
The other point I wanted to make is that if you are quibbling over a few $1,000s in salary, that's a big red flag.
In both sides.
Yeah.
If you're the employee, and that's a big deal, or if you're the employer, and that's a big deal, be cautious.
Why is that a big deal?
If they're quibbling about it now, give it 3 months, and it'll be other things. It'll be, hey, I've been here like 6 months and haven't even gotten a raise yet, or whatever. There are legitimate cases where a few $1,000s, like I'm currently making X, or with your benefits package instead of the one I have, there's a gap of this much. Can you help me make up the difference? That's a different story than just like, well, I asked for 85 and they offered me 85, so I should ask for 88. just, on principle, no, there's not such a principle in my book.
I always ask the compensation question, and I always lead up to it with a company sell, to where sometimes they'll be excited to work for us and they'll tell me they'll work for a little bit less. And one of my favorite things to do is offer people more than they ask for.
Right.
It's the upfront thing, like, hey, they value me, they really care about me. And in almost every situation, I try to offer them more if I really like them than what they ask for.
Right. Yeah, I like to ask it sometimes is, what level of compensation would make you be happy to work
Right.
at
Exactly right.
X? Yes.
I hired a guy similar to that. I asked him what he wanted, he told me, I gave him a few thousand to work. Within 8 weeks, he was asking when would he get his first raise. Yeah.
That, I would say that's typically unusual when you over-offer.
But
people just don't
it turned out he did not know what he really needed.
Oh.
You may not even know what you're paying.
Well,
I mean, I worked at a company for a couple of years where I realized, hey, this is going out for
well, we were paying.
Wait, you guys don't even back pay. They did.
That's a lot of taxes. Yes.
See, that's my situation. I'm currently in school, currently unemployed. I just came out of basically construction.
Yeah.
And I'm going after a CS major. I've only got like a year left, and I'm like, where would I actually fit into a prospective company's idea of what my skills are worth?
Yeah, no, and that's a great situation.
I mean, I've given the answer of, I didn't know what I want. I'm sure you're gonna make me a good offer, but I don't know what my time's worth. I mean, that's not the case anymore,
Right.
but at one time that is.
And it is fair, if the way you really feel about it as a candidate is, right now, I don't really know what I'm worth, but I would like to see what you value me at. And, I have some, X level of interest in working here. And for you, I run into a lot of people that have kind of non-traditional backgrounds. And I like to think that I'm good at giving them a chance and trying to see the whole picture. If you've got a background in another industry, it might be that you've managed projects, or you've had similar problems in a different field. Getting stuff done on time and on budget is universal to a lot of industries. There are things like that you bring to the table. I've liked hiring even entry-level programmers who are, not to say a little older, but who have more overall work experience. If you've got an 8-year work history and only 2 years in my field, that's different than someone who's got 2 years of work history, both in my field, and they may even still be in school. You get a different you get some of the other non-tangibles.
And I would be honest about it, just straight up front. I just barely went back to work after 10 years of being home with my children. And so I have the same problem. I don't know what I'm worth. I have a master's degree, but I've not worked in over 10 years. So I can't tell you what I'm worth. My education's here, my experience is here. And being very frank and upfront with them and saying, this is really where it's at. And I was very surprised by the offers I got, because they very clearly said, this is where my level is, this is where my experience is, and here's the reasons why. And so tell me what I'm worth.
Yeah,
and be very frank about it.
And as a candidate, don't be afraid to play up the things that you have been doing. I mean, obviously you've been doing something with your time.
Yeah.
Whether that's being a mother, or being a volunteer somewhere, or whatever it is you're doing with your time. Even if it's just, even if it's being a student, that says something about you and what you like to do. I worked in the industry for X amount of time, and I decided to go back to grad school. Stopped working for 3 years while I went to go get another degree or something. Everybody's got their story, and finding it out usually pays off. You can get to know a lot about a person that way. So technical questions are tricky. Here's an example of one. I don't know how well you can see it, but there's like a formula on the little strips that you have to figure it out in order to be able to call a number. A couple of years ago, I saw billboards driving to and from work where someone had hexadecimal on this billboard. It turned out to be ASCII. There was another one that had something that was base 64 encoded. If you could recognize it, decode it, and then it would tell you, how to go contact them for the job.
I've seen that very often embedded in the head tags of people of companies' web pages.
Yeah.
Just like either little ASCII art logos or something base 64 encoded that if you decode it, you say, hey, want a job? Email us.
Right. And that, there are some interesting things about that from a marketing standpoint, from a filtering standpoint. I'm a big believer in using technical questions. Absolutely, use them. But how many, how hard, and what kind are very widely debated. Yes?
Well, okay, when I started out at the company I'm working at, I was on the tech floor. I studied for a month to get an interview there. So I knew like this much technical stuff when I started at Wheels.
Yeah.
And one day they were hiring for the QA department, and my husband's like, you should apply. Why? I don't have the technical skills. And he gave me a call. He really did bully me into it.
Yeah.
One of the questions is the interviewer plopped me down in front of a system I had never seen before. And he asked me, what's going on this account? That was, and I'm like, okay. So I looked. I'm like, okay, well, these dates line up. Looks like we had a rename here because it says rename right here, and I ran through it. I wasn't a fit for the QA position. However, he managed to kind of sideline me into a different position where I did billing system corruption.
Yeah.
And eventually, that side position got me, he kind of shuffled me sideways into QA, and now I actually am the supervisor for the billing ops department at Bluehost. I had no technical skills, but in being able to see the patterns and whatnot, and just an odd technical question.
Right.
Seeing the patterns is.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to apply for the jobs.
But, you know,
Don't be afraid to apply for the jobs that are next to the ones you want to be in eventually. You know, QA can be a great entry point into a technical job because you're going to have this level of familiarity with it. You know what the issues are. For coming up with good technical questions, some people like the thinker, brain teaser questions. There are some things you learn from those and other things that you don't. Having code on a whiteboard can be kind of awkward, but yes, you learn some stuff. JavaScript interviews can be a lot of fun because you say, hey, write a function to do this. And there are so many different correct, or at least defensible ways to write JavaScript functions that you can learn a lot about them by how they even start off. And so think about the questions that will most help you get to what you want to know about the candidate. Yes?
So I found it valuable as I've been interviewing people for 5 or 6 years now. I have a pretty standard interview that I morph a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
So somebody walks in, I have a big section, which is most of my technical questions, which is generic to every programmer in existence. Do you find that valuable to compare one interview candidate to another, or do you prefer to have an entirely unique interview for each candidate?
I like consistency when I've got a bunch that are all kind of interviewing for similar positions. If I'm just hiring for one position, I find that it ends up being more about the person than about their total score on some rubric of stuff.
Well, I don't have a rubric, but I have a regular interview that helps me find out the same things about each person.
Right. I do tend to go back to that as kind of my core. But depending on the candidate and what they've done, there are different things that I throw in or leave out. If it's a junior person just out of school, I don't need to go in depth on, over the last 5 years at your job, what have you, doesn't apply. Another one is practical questions. So there are good and bad about practical questions. Giving someone a coding problem, or for HTML and CSS, we'd say, here, build this page, stuff like that. There's some good and some bad to it. I mean, be careful how much you're asking the interviewee to commit to, because if you're asking them to do work for you for free to try and qualify for the job, be careful how much you ask, because some of the best people you want value their time enough that forget that. I already know I don't want to work there. So be careful, but you do learn a lot of valuable stuff from it. If you have a job for someone that's putting together chairs, and it doesn't take 6 hours to put together a chair if you're good, then, I always like to ask them, if we do give them an exercise, how long they spent on it. If it was 2 hours versus 4 hours versus 8 hours, that says a lot about the candidate too.
Seriously, comment.
Sorry, my screen over here stopped advancing. So I'm trying to get back on track. Let's go for this one.
You're coming up on 5 minutes.
Okay. So a little bit more of my thoughts on the interviewing. I usually think that if I don't know quickly whether they're a fit or not, they're probably not. If they're not a fit, at least try to make it something they can benefit from. Whether it's teaching them, giving helpful feedback, saying, you know, what we're really looking for is this. It looks like you're strong in these areas, and you know, whatever you can to make it helpful for them, since they did take the time to come and meet with you and give it a shot. Remember always that it is a two-way street. Always, always, always try and let them ask their questions. You can learn a lot about them by the questions they ask too. Sometimes some of the questions people have asked me have really been the thing that sealed the deal most for them getting the offer. And then, you know, just letting them know.
They're the ones who ask about the good bars in town.
Especially here. Anybody who's been here long enough knows that if you're in Provo, there's, sorry. So, you know, for me personally, keeping it brief has tended to work pretty well. But it depends a lot on your situation. You know, there are a plethora of different situations, and tailoring your interview process to the situation obviously makes a lot more sense than just having something generic every time. So finding out from a candidate what motivates them, to me, can be a big thing for identifying what I'm going to like out of them. Do they have mostly external motivators, or are they internally motivated? Are they like learning? They just enjoy the challenge of it, whatever that is. You know, if they're externally motivated, are they carrot motivated or more stick motivated? I don't like having people on my team that are stick motivated because I don't like wielding a stick. So, you know, that's, yes.
I always ask about hobbies.
Yeah.
Because you can learn so much about a technical person depending on what they like to do, and you can get them to talk about that stuff. And if they don't do anything technical outside of just their job, that tells you something.
Right. It does. And it can say different things about different people. I really enjoy my work, but I've got 8 kids, so I don't do a whole lot of coding in the evenings. You know, it depends on the situation. There are other guys, some of the best coders I know are the ones who, you know, he programs web games in his off time. And, you know, they're fun ones too. So finding out what they already know, obviously, is a part of the filter. Their current skills, their background, what they've experienced, that tells you a lot and can be a big factor in whether or not you want them for your job. Depending on the job, sometimes the more important one, though, is what does their growth curve look like? Especially for kind of junior people, trying to find out how fast they learn or how easily they learn or how much they enjoy learning can be a better indicator of where they're going to end up in a year after working with your company. There are some people we've hired who really don't know the job very well that we want them to fill. But as we look and talk with them about their background, their experience, their history, they love learning, they're good at it, and they just haven't been in the right place to learn the things that we need them to know. So, you know, 3 months later after they started, then, oh yeah, they were a good hire. So, and then, you know, lining up the compensation expectations. As a candidate, deciding is this the right company is related but different. You know, do we get along well? Nobody likes having uncomfortable boss situations. At least nobody I know. Personality and communication style mean a lot. If the way this guy communicates stuff drives you crazy, don't go there. It just won't work. And remember to think about the team as well as just the manager. If their team has that new guy already, then no matter how normal you are, that won't make that job a super pleasant place to be. If there's someone who just rubs you the wrong way, you know, looking at, you know, I always, whenever I can, I like to have the candidates be physically at our location so that they see it, they know what they're in for, and you know, openness. This is what it is. Do you like the culture, the environment? Do they seem like the kind of people that trust their employees to do their jobs? Are there growth opportunities? If you're at a point where that matters to you, then by all means make sure that it's there. So do I like it here is one thing. Do I like the work here is another. Both enjoying it And importantly, being able to perform it well. If you don't feel like you're not sure you're going to be able to do this job that well, then they probably won't either. And then, you know, obviously the rewards are part of it. I would advocate that they not be your only thing, unless all you're after is money, you don't care if you have fun with it. But you can't force a win-win. Higher compensation does not make up for bad culture, at least not completely. It can mitigate it a little bit, but there are some places it would be really hard to pay me enough to work there long-term. And some places I just would never take, no matter how much you offer to pay me, the other things I'd have to sacrifice to work there would just not be worth it. Yeah?
On the lines of the rewards, or whatever you want to call them, I've taken a hard look at employment contracts lately.
Yeah.
I've been offered things, and I keep calling it the right to legislate my future clauses or whatever.
Oh.
Where they are, we have a vague, open-ended description of our business, and you're not allowed to work in Eagles for 2 years. After you leave us, whether you walk, and those have been disturbing me. I just want to know what your opinions or any other opinions were on, because that's, we talked about the reward,
Yeah.
I get compensation, I have benefits there, but afterwards, now even if you lay me off, you're still dictating where I work, and it's I turned down a job based on that. And
So,
like, this is ridiculous.
yeah, as an employer, be very conscious of what you're putting in there. Make sure it's worth it to you to risk turning off good people. But, you know, Utah, you know, this very state to state is a right to work state.
Yeah.
So some of those are not very enforceable. I can understand, and currently where I work, I happily signed one that says, I will not go work for any of these competitors or people in these specific industries. Doesn't say anything about you can't be a programmer. That wouldn't fly very well. But, you know, I work in a company that does security and home automation, among other things, solar energy. And so there are a few specific competitors named and some very specific industries that would be full of competitors. And so, yeah, I can agree not to work for those for a year. No problem. But
Make
for
sure they're not
software-
open-ended, like they have
This
limitations.
one was very open-ended, the one I turned down.
Yeah,
Open to
open-ended
interpretation.
probably would end up being unenforceable, but the fact that they asked you to do it is probably a red flag. Yeah.
Well, at least in Idaho, if you don't have the non-compete at the initial contract, if you try to put a non-compete in later, you have to pay them. You can do it, you have one shot when they hire to do it, otherwise you're going to have to pay them to do
You
it.
got to compensate them for that agreement. Yeah, that makes sense. Wrap it up here quickly since we're out of time. Interviews. Go away. Hey, think about it like, HR would kill me for saying this, but think about it kind of like a date. You know, if you were going on a date, first date, you want to see, do I want to have a second one? Would I want to spend a lot of time with this person for the foreseeable future? You know, that's what it is. And call back. You know, if you interview someone, call them back.
Even if
Please
it's
tell
a no.
them. Even if it's a no. Let them know, hey, thanks for coming in. We appreciate your time. I can't tell you how many times I've been glad that we kept in touch with the candidate because they weren't fit for that job. But a year or two down the road or at another company, you run into them, and you're still on pretty good terms with them. You know, don't burn your bridges if you don't have to.
It also helps your brand.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you burned bridges for that person, but it burned for others.
Right, they might recommend, we've had candidates recommend those bridges by other parents too. We've gone through a lot of questions, I'm happy to stay and talk for whatever. Thanks for coming.